Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Navigating vSphere using the vSphere client. In this lesson, we'll start off with some vSphere terminology, or the lingo related to virtual infrastructures. I'll show you how to use the vSphere client, including things like performing virtual machine guest remote control, navigating the vSphere client with hotkeys, searching the virtual infrastructure, sorting and filtering in the vSphere client. I'll show you how to export data and run reports. So with that, let's get started. If you haven't worked in vSphere virtual infrastructures before, it's critical that you're familiar with these vSphere terms. So first off, you've got your vCenter server. Your vCenter server is a centralized management console for your entire virtual infrastructure. And of course, we have a lesson in this training course on how to install and configure your vCenter server. The vSphere client is your management tool, be it running on Windows or through a web interface, that you connect to the vCenter server to manage the virtual infrastructure. So that's your tool. You run your vSphere client and you connect to vCenter or even to an individual ESXi server. And of course, ESXi is the hypervisor that's installed on each physical server. You can think of that as the virtualization operating system running on all the physical hosts. VMA, or the vSphere Management Assistant, is a Linux-based virtual appliance that you import. It's free from VMware, and then it gives you a service console like you had back in ESX Server that you can use to manage multiple ESXi servers from the command line. A data center, or a virtual data center, is a storage container that you create inside vCenter to manage ESX hosts, resource pools, folders, virtual machines, everything underneath. The data center is really the first thing that you create when you bring up vCenter and you connect to vCenter with your vSphere client. You're going to first have to create a container to hold everything, and that's going to be your data center or your virtual data center. Of course, a virtual machine, or a VM as we typically call it, is a virtualized operating system running inside ESXi. So a virtual machine could be running, let's say, Windows 7 or Windows Server 2008 or Linux, and it's a fully virtualized physical server that you've moved into the virtual infrastructure or even an end-user desktop. Then you've got the host and guest concept. So the host is going to be the ESXi server, the physical host, and then the guest is going to be the virtual machine. So you might hear those terms used quite a bit when people talk about virtual infrastructures. You've got the host and the guest. The host is going to be the physical ESXi server. The guest, again, is the virtualized operating system. And you even have those terms, let's say if you're running VMware Workstation locally on your own computer, you've got the host, that's your local computer running VMware Workstation, and then the guest is each of the virtual machines that you create. Another critical term to know is a data store. A data store is a storage container in the virtual infrastructure. So with VMware vSphere, to store virtual machines, you need to create a data store. That data store you can think of as really a formatted file system. It's formatted typically with the VMFS, or the VMware file system. It could even be the NFS file system. There's really two different file systems you can use with vSphere. And then the underlying storage technology could be a local SATA disk, it could be iSCSI or Fiber Channel, or if it's NFS, it's going to be an NFS NAS. So the data store is your storage container regardless of what underlying storage technology you have. So you could have multiple data stores local, you could have multiple data stores on a storage area network, but that's where your virtual machines are going to be stored. A folder in the virtual infrastructure is just like a folder in Microsoft Windows. It's a directory or a container for other things. In the case of the virtual infrastructure, you can optionally create a folder to hold things like ESXi servers, virtual machines, resource pools, and clusters. Speaking of which, a resource pool is another type of container in the vSphere virtual infrastructure inventory that holds the resources of the ESXi servers. So let's say that you want to use distributed resource scheduler to ensure that your virtual machines are getting the resources that they need. When you create a DRS cluster, there's automatically a resource pool created underneath it that holds all the resources of the ESXi servers you put into that DRS cluster. So those resources are things like CPU, memory, disk, and network. And then you can use that resource pool to provide quality of service to ensure that the virtual machines that need the greatest amount of resources are getting the resources that they need. And then there's a cluster. I mentioned a cluster. There's multiple types of cluster. There's DRS clusters, which are more for performance optimization. And then there's high availability clusters, which are for, of course, high availability, ensuring that virtual machines automatically get restarted on other hosts if an ESXi server fails. And you can have a cluster that's enabled for both for DRS and for VMHA. And throughout this course, don't you worry, we'll be creating all of these things: vCenter servers, data centers, hosts, guests, data stores, folders, resource pools, clusters, and then the last one is networks, where in the case of the virtual infrastructure, we'll be creating virtual networks. So if you think about a data center that has traditional physical switches that connect the physical servers, you can think of the virtual networks as having virtual switches that are connecting all the virtual servers together. So that's what a virtual network does, and there's various types of virtual networks, all of which we'll be exploring in this course. So don't worry at this point if these terms are flying at you faster than you're able to fully understand, because I'll be showing you examples of all these things, and we'll be creating all these things in this course. But I first wanted to give you a brief rundown of the terminology related to a vSphere virtual infrastructure, just so you have some familiarity with it. So with that, we'll move on, and we'll talk about using the vSphere client. And don't worry, I'm about to show you this, but first I want to give you a brief introduction. The vSphere client, of course, is the Windows-based client. There's also a new web version of it in vSphere 5, but in this lesson we'll be focusing on the traditional Windows-based vSphere client. It has a home screen, but you don't always go into the home screen when you connect to vCenter with the vSphere client. What will happen is you'll go back to the last view that you were in. That's where you will be put back to when you reconnect to the same vCenter server. But it does have a very nice home screen that allows you to navigate to everything in the vSphere client. It's only going to display what you have licensed. So if you don't have a license, let's say to use VMware's high availability or distributed resource scheduler, those things will just be grayed out. You won't be able to enable those things. There's different views if you connect to a vCenter server versus directly to an ESXi or ESX server. So you should also know that there's different views when you connect to a vCenter server versus to an ESXi server. So an ESXi server, like on the home screen, is only going to give you about 3 or 4 icons versus the home screen for a vCenter server, especially if you have a bunch of plugins installed, you'll have a ton of icons on there. So the view is going to be very different from vCenter to a direct connection on an ESXi server. However, most of us are going to spend our time directly connected to a vCenter server. I mean, that's the easiest and most popular way to manage your virtual infrastructure. Now, the vSphere client does have a back functionality like a web browser. That's that little red arrow you see right there on the top left-hand side of the graphic. You can click that back arrow, and just like a web browser, it'll take you to the view in the vSphere client that you were previously in. So that's a very nice feature of the vSphere client that you can take advantage of. So without further delay, let's go over to our vSphere client. I've already got it connected to my vCenter server, and let me show you how it works. Okay, here we go. This is the vSphere client. This happens to be version 5 of the vSphere client that connects to vSphere 5. I've got a whole separate lesson in this series that shows you how to download and install the vSphere client. But at this point, I just want to give you a quick overview so you can see what this looks like in action. Here I've selected a particular ESXi server, and on the left-hand side, this is the hosts and clusters inventory. So you get this inventory tree on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, you have detail about whatever object you've selected. In this case, it's a particular ESXi server. Notice the host name of the server and the version of VMware ESXi that it's running. You can also see the tabs that go across the top here. These tabs are very important. In the case of an ESXi server, you'll have tabs like Summary, Virtual Machines, Performance, Configuration, Task and Events, Alarms, Permissions, Maps, Storage Views, and Hardware Status. But if you click on a virtual machine in the tree here, you'll have a different set of tabs. And the same thing if you click on, let's say, the vCenter server at the highest level, again, a completely different set of tabs. So the point is that this area over here with the tabs and the detailed information is going to change based on where you are in the inventory tree. So in the inventory tree here at the top level, I've got the vCenter server. I've got virtual data centers underneath that I created. I happen to have an HADRS cluster. You may or may not have a cluster. And then in the cluster, I've got ESXi servers and virtual machines. If you don't have a cluster, your ESXi servers and virtual machines will just be underneath the virtual data center, or they could be in a folder or a resource pool. So there's also different types of inventories. So up here in the navigation, I can click here and I can do a drop down and go over to inventory. And you can see besides hosts and clusters, there's also virtual machines and templates, data stores and data store clusters, and networking. I can also go to the home screen up here by clicking the home button. And you notice this is also a great way to find anything you could potentially want to do in the vSphere client. Here in the inventory area, I've got search and then the various inventories I just showed you. And then underneath administration, I've got roles, sessions, licensing, system logs, vCenter server settings, vCenter solutions manager, which is new in vSphere 5, storage providers, which is new in vSphere 5, and vCenter service status. Then underneath management, I've got scheduled tasks, events, maps, host profiles, virtual machine storage profiles, and customization specifications manager. Finally, I happen to have a solutions and applications section here, which you may or may not have on your vSphere client. It just depends if you have any applications installed, which are typically installed as vSphere client plugins. So I happen to have one installed, which is VMware Data Recovery. So this is a nice way to navigate through the vSphere client. You can also navigate through the vSphere client using the drop-down menus here across the top. Underneath inventory, you see the same types of inventory views that you see on the home screen. Underneath administration, there's also a number of the same administration tasks that you saw on the home screen. But still, most VMware admins spend their time in the hosts and clusters inventory. I would say that the hosts and clusters inventory is where most VMware admins spend about 80% of their time. So in this hosts and clusters inventory, there may be multiple ways to do the same thing. For example, let's say I want to go to the virtual machine console for a particular virtual machine like vCenter. If I go to that vCenter virtual machine, I can right-click on the object over here and I can open the console. I could also close that window out. Then I could go down here and I could select to open the console from within the detail screen for that particular virtual machine. And then besides just a couple ways to do it, there's actually two more ways to open the virtual machine console. I can go to a toolbar up here that has a button called Launch Virtual Machine Console. And then finally, in the case of console, it has its own tab. I can click on that tab, and again, I have access to the virtual machine console. So in the case of that one particular function, there's at least 4 different ways to access it. Now, it isn't the same for every type of thing you might want to do on a virtual machine or an ESXi server. But for example, in the case of editing the virtual machine settings, I can right-click on the virtual machine and I can edit settings here. I can also go to the details screen here, and I can click there to edit the settings on the virtual machine. So that's generally how the vSphere client works. You spend your time in the inventory here, you click on different objects in the inventory, you can right-click on those objects to perform tasks, or go in here to particular tabs. Let's say you want to configure an ESXi server, and then you can perform tasks from within these tabs. Then you also have the home screen, and then on the bottom down here you have a status which shows you which tasks have been completed and which tasks are still in progress. Finally, there's a view here of triggered alarms, basically anything that's going wrong or exceeding whatever metric you've set, like a ESXi server that's maxing out its physical RAM. That might be an alert that pops up down here in the alarm screen. But still, the recent tasks is where most people spend their time, and then the hosts and clusters inventory is where most people spend their time. So with that, let's go back to our slides and let's learn a little bit more about the vSphere client. Now that you've had a chance to see the vSphere client in action and hopefully you're feeling more comfortable with it, I want to point out some specific areas of the vSphere client window to make sure you know the official name of that area and what it does. I'll start from the top left up here. So at the top, across the top, just like a traditional Windows application, you have your drop-down menus. And if you notice the little letters on each of the names of the menus, the drop-down menus that are underlined, that's actually the hotkey to drop down that window. So like to drop down a file, you would do Alt F, just like in, let's say, Microsoft Word. So you've got these drop down menus across the top, and then below that you've got a navigation bar. And this navigation bar shows you, on the internet they would call it your cookie trail, but it starts with home, and then it shows you where you've drilled down from home into inventory, and then drilled down from there into hosts and clusters. So at any point here you can click on one of these and you could go back up a level. And there's even a drop down, let's say on inventory. If you click on inventory, it drops down and it shows you how you can go into the different types of inventories. Then you've got the search bar on the right hand side. Below that you've got a toolbar that can be turned on or off, and here you can use it to do things like create new folders, data centers, or virtual machines. And then below that, on the left hand side here, you've got the inventory panel. And this inventory panel is in any of the inventory views that you go into. Could be virtual machines and templates, could be hosts and clusters, could be storage or network. And then on the right hand side here, you've got the more detailed view based on whatever you've selected in the inventory, and then that detailed view has tabs across the top. And sometimes you may have to scroll to the right or left if there's too many tabs to be viewed in your window. Below that you've got the recent task screen here that can be turned on or off, and you can view tasks or alarms. Below that there is a status bar that gives you some additional information, such as if your evaluation license is expiring, and it also tells you who you're logged in at. So that's a quick overview of the different areas that make up the vSphere client and their official names and functions. So with that, let's move on. And let's talk about performing virtual machine guest remote control. This is also called opening up a virtual machine console. You'll see open up console or open console in the vSphere client. What you're doing here is you're going to a virtual machine and you're controlling the console of that virtual machine. So if you were on a physical server and you had a monitor hooked up to the physical server, you had a keyboard and a mouse, and you were accessing the console of that physical server, here you're doing the exact same thing, but you're doing it through the vSphere client, and it's all done in software. So you're able to control that operating system through your operating system running the vSphere client. Now, to do this, it's highly recommended you install the VMware tools in each of your guest operating systems, and not just to perform remote control or to open up the console, but to get a much better performance, and also not to have your mouse locked into the console window. I think you'll very quickly find it's very annoying to have your mouse locked into that window, and you'll actually have to press Control-Alt to release your mouse every time. So you'll get a lot better performance, and the virtual machine tools will also enable features like memory ballooning that otherwise will simply be unavailable if the virtual machine tools are not installed. And I've got a whole other lesson in this course on installing and using VMware tools. So the virtual machine console is accessed either by a console tab if you've selected that virtual machine in the inventory, or by a pop-up window. So you can just really right-click on any virtual machine and click to open the virtual machine console, and a new window will come up, and that's the console for that guest operating system. Now, the hotkeys that you need to be aware of, especially if no VMware tools are installed, you'll have to press Control then Alt to release the mouse once you click on the window. Once you click on the window, you've selected that console operating system, and then you can type in there. So your keyboard is redirected to that console or that guest operating system. But if you try to get your mouse out and you don't have the VMware tools installed, you'll find very quickly your mouse is stuck in that window, and you have to hold down Control and press Alt to release it. And I'll show you how this works whether you have the VMware tools installed or not. Another hotkey you need to be aware of is Control-Alt-Insert, which is the same thing as pressing Control-Alt-Delete. So if you want to press Control-Alt-Delete, let's say to log into a Windows server, and you're accessing a virtual machine guest console, you'll hold down Control-Alt-Insert, and that'll actually send Control-Alt-Delete to the guest operating system. Again, something you really need to be aware of. Otherwise, you'll press Control-Alt-Delete, and that'll go to your local operating system, and it'll completely mess up whatever it is you're trying to do. And then the last key to be aware of is Control-Alt-Enter. Control-Alt-Enter will actually switch back and forth between the console window and a full screen version of the console window. So you can go into View Full Screen, and view the console full screen by clicking on the View button on the top of the window there. But to get out of it and go back, you actually need to know to press Control-Alt-Enter and switch out of the full screen view and back to the window view. So now let me go over to my vSphere client and show you exactly how all this works. So I talked about how there's multiple ways to access a virtual machine's console or remote control of a guest virtual machine. No matter which way you choose, let's say we click Open Console right here. Once you get inside the console, you need to know what to expect. Let me move this window around over here and actually drag it out a little bit, and you'll see what happens is now I can actually maximize that window. It's giving me a warning here that there are 2 active connections to this console. That's because I've been going in and out of the console so much. I'm just going to close out that warning. It really doesn't matter. I know I'm the only person accessing this virtual machine console. So right now you may notice that there's 2 mice. Actually, I've got a pointer over here on the right hand side, and I've got a pointer here on the middle of the screen. So the pointer on the right hand side over here is my local mouse. And if I move over here to the center of the screen, if I click, then I'm taking control of the virtual machine's mouse, and I can move that around. You may notice it can be a little jumpy at times. You just have to have a little patience. Accessing a virtual machine's console through the vSphere client really isn't meant to give you the best performance. It's not meant for you to use it on a day-to-day basis to run some application. If you want to do that, then I recommend using, let's say, like Windows Remote Desktop. But the virtual machine console with the vSphere client is meant for you to access the real server console to perform tasks such as loading the operating system, rebooting the server, installing the VMware tools, and perhaps installing some critical application. So once I've taken control of the mouse in the virtual machine console, if I try to move my mouse out, you notice now that I have 2 mouse pointers again. And this actually works because I have the VMware tools installed. So I didn't have to actually do anything to release control of the console and gain access to my local mouse. However, if we go over to a console where I don't have the VMware tools installed, this is actually the console for the Vima virtual appliance, and while it doesn't have a graphical interface, what happens as soon as I click on the console here is that I've lost control of my mouse. My mouse is locked into that console, and the only way for me to get my mouse out is to hold down the control key and press Alt. Suddenly you can see my mouse has been released. I now have control of my mouse pointer. If I click on the console again, now I can move my mouse around all I want, but I don't have access to it. So knowing that Control and Alt key combination to release your mouse is very important to VMware admins, because you never know when you're going to access a virtual machine console that doesn't have the VMware tools installed. Again, I've got a whole separate lesson on the VMware tools. I'll show you how to install them. I'll talk more about their importance other than just the fact that the mouse driver is loaded and your mouse doesn't get stuck in the console. There's a lot more to them than just that. But this is one of the most obvious things that the VMware tools will do for you, is to make your mouse seamless really between the guest virtual machine console and your local operating system. Now let's go back to that vCenter server virtual machine that does have the VMware tools installed. Something else I want to show you here is if you click on the console of a virtual machine to press Control-Alt-Delete, if you actually press Control-Alt-Delete, even though you've selected the guest operating system console, that'll send Control-Alt-Delete to your local operating system. And you know what happens if you press Control-Alt-Delete in Windows. This big screen will pop up that asks you if you want to lock the console or start the task manager. You don't want that to happen. That'll really interrupt whatever you're doing. To actually press Control-Alt-Delete in the guest operating system, you hold down Control, then Alt, then you press Insert. And there you go. That's how you actually press Control-Alt-Delete. Now, if you can't remember that, you can get your mouse out of here. I'm just going to press Escape. And you can go up to the Virtual Machine drop-down up here. You can go to Guest, and then you can go to Send Control-Alt-Delete. And that's another way to do it. So that's going to allow you to log into the virtual machine, which of course is what you want to be able to do. You need to be able to do. And then from here, another key combination I want to show you is Control, Alt, and Enter. Control, Alt, and Enter actually makes that virtual machine console a full screen. So as you can see, we've gone full screen here. It says at the top, to leave full screen, you can press Control, Alt, Enter again. And I could even go in here and let's say I could change the screen resolution of this virtual machine to really match the screen resolution on the monitor that I'm using. And the whole point of this, of course, going full screen and changing the resolution, might be to try to make the virtual machine console more usable. But again, if you're going to be using this every day, I highly recommend that you use the vSphere virtual machine console to enable remote desktop, assuming it's a Windows system, and use remote desktop just to connect to that Windows virtual machine. You're going to get a lot better performance. But again, this virtual machine console is very usable. I can go down here to start. You can see it's relatively peppy, but again, it's all dependent on the type of network connection that you have. So this is the virtual machine console that you'll find in the vSphere client. To get out of this, since we have the VMware tools installed, I don't have to hold down Control and press Alt. I can just go up here and I can click that button there to restore it back to the window view that I was in before. And again, you also have the drop-down menu across the top here where I can exit the console. I can choose to view the console in different ways, including full screen. I can go to the virtual machine drop-down here and I can power off, power on, shut down the guest, install and upgrade the VMware tools, take a snapshot, edit the settings, clone, and do a variety of other things. I've also got the toolbar across the top here where I can shut down the guest, suspend, power on the guest, restart the guest, take snapshots of the virtual machine, and then here I can use this to connect a CD or DVD drive. So this virtual machine, just like all virtual machines by default, has a single virtual CD DVD drive. So I can actually connect this to the D drive on my local computer. I could connect it to an ISO image on the local disk. I could connect it to a device on the host, like the physical CD-ROM drive on the server, or to an ISO image on a VMware vSphere data store. So all these different methods would be used to get software or get files to the virtual machine. So let's say that I wanted to upgrade vSphere on this virtual machine. I could connect the virtual CD DVD drive to an ISO image on my local disk. Right here I've got the vCenter Media, and when I click on that, I've mounted the ISO file from my local computer over the network to this virtual machine that's running on my ESXi server. And then because that DVD image has an auto run, notice the autoplay pops up here, and then I can launch the auto run just like what would happen if I put that DVD into a physical Windows server. So I've mounted this 2 gig ISO image over the network to a virtual vCenter server. And that's the same way that you would install your guest operating system. I'll be showing you how to do all that later in this video training series. So with that, let's go back to our slides. To be a proficient VMware administrator, something else you need to be aware of is how to navigate the vSphere client using hotkeys, or very quickly using keyboard shortcuts, as many times these are called. So instead of having to click on everything with your mouse, there's these shortcut keys you can press, or hotkeys you can press, to accomplish things very quickly in the vSphere client. And I've got examples of some of these on the screen here. I already mentioned how the menu bar, the top menu bar across the top of the vSphere client, you can always use like Alt and F to access the file menu and so forth. But there's also hotkeys for just about every major function in the vSphere client. It's really very cool. So on the screen here you can see how you can just press Control-Shift-F to search. Anytime you want to search, press Control-Shift-F and that'll bring up the search window. To go to the hosts and clusters inventory, by far the most popular inventory view, just press Control-Shift-H. And then there's shortcuts for all the other types of inventory views. There's shortcuts for the management task, like if you want to check out the latest events, it's Control-Shift-E. And then there's shortcuts as well for all the administrative tasks, such as going into roles, sessions, licensing logs, server settings. And then there's also shortcuts for all of the administration tasks, such as going into roles, sessions, licensing, system logs, and server settings. So if you want to check out the status of your vSphere licenses, Control-Shift-L will very quickly take you into the license management view. So with that, let's go over to our vSphere client and I'll show you how this works. The great thing about these vSphere client keyboard shortcuts is that you don't have to memorize them or write them down. they're actually up here and they're always being reminded to you every time you use this menu. So let's say I wanted to go into the data stores and data stores cluster. It's just Control Shift and D, and there we go. We're in the data stores inventory. I'll click back here, and let's say that we wanted to go into, let's say, the maps view. It's Control Shift M. So I'll just hold down Control Shift and then M. And here we are in the maps view. So I'll click on a checkbox up there to map our virtual infrastructure, and it just happens that quick. Another example here, let's say that we're in the events view, and let's say we want to use a keyboard shortcut from the drop-down menu up top. If I hold down Alt, notice the little underlines that appear under these different menu drop-downs. So if I hold down Alt and I press A, that drops down the administration view, and then I can press V to edit the vCenter server settings. Again, just another way to use keyboard shortcuts. Of course, I can use Tab, and I can tab through the different options on the menu here. I can also use up and down arrow keys and left and right. I can tab through and I can use the Enter key to press OK or to press Cancel. I can also use Escape in many of these menus. So there's a lot of things you can do. And of course, the more time you spend in the vSphere client, the more efficient a VMware admin you're going to get if you practice with these keyboard shortcuts. All right, so with that, let's go back to our slides and learn more about the vSphere client. Moving on, let's talk about searching the virtual infrastructure. Now, perhaps if you just have a couple ESXi servers and let's say 10 or 20 virtual machines, maybe searching really isn't that big a deal. It's not that important to you. But once you have, let's say, 10 or more ESXi servers and 100 or more virtual machines, suddenly searching becomes a very critical daily task that you have to perform just to find what you're looking for. So you can think of searching the virtual infrastructure like Google for the virtual infrastructure. So with searching, you can search the virtual infrastructure really from any window or any view in the vSphere client, but there's also an advanced search window that's dedicated just to performing advanced searches, and you can access that by going to the home screen and clicking on search, or by holding down Control, then Shift, then F. You can think of F as fine, but really it's search. So there's multiple ways to access search, and then there's basic versus advanced searches. You can search for virtual machines, hosts, data stores, networks, and folders. Linked mode is even supported with searching. So let's say you have 20 remote sites. Each of them has their own vCenter server. You've connected them all with vCenter linked mode. From your single connection with the vSphere client to a single vCenter server, if you perform a search, it'll actually search across all the vCenter servers in all your locations in order to ensure that you find what you're looking for across the entire company-wide virtual infrastructure. So now let's go over to the vSphere client and let me show you how to perform not only some simple but also some more advanced searches. Searching through the vSphere client is always easy because you've got this box on the top right hand corner up here that says Search Inventory. So you can just type a string in here, press Enter, and you get some quick search results, and you can actually click on these search results and use them, and they'll take you directly to that particular object in the virtual infrastructure. If you want to be more specific, you can search here by different object types in the virtual infrastructure. So let's say I was looking for a host that had the number 1 in the name. I'll just type 1 in there, press Enter, and I very quickly find ESXi server number 1. I'll click on that, and it takes me directly to that server in the virtual infrastructure. Now I can also do a drop down here and I can click Advanced Search, and that brings me to the full screen Advanced Search window in the vSphere client. Now this window can also be accessed by going to Home and clicking on Search, and you can also access the same window by holding down Control, Shift, and then F. So in this window you can actually perform the same basic searches here, like I'll just type in Win and see what objects we find that have the string Win in the virtual infrastructure. But to truly perform an advanced search, you click on Show Options right here. And then what you can start doing is adding properties. So for example, I could add virtual machine properties. Let's say a virtual machine that has a guest OS that contains Win. And then I'll add another property, and I'm looking for a virtual machine that has a power state that is powered on. And then finally, virtual machines let's see, that have their VMware Tools status either installed or up to date. I'll click search again here, and no results were found. That's because in my particular lab, I don't have any Windows virtual machines that are powered on that have their VMware Tools installed or up to date. So what if I said that I'm looking for virtual machines that have the string Win in their guest operating system that are powered on, but their tools are out of date? I'll click search here, and there we go. We find two virtual machines. Notice they have the string Win in the guest operating system name right here. They are powered on. If we scroll to the right, you can see their tool status is out of date. So the point of showing you this is that you can create these pretty advanced searches here, and you can add all different sorts of properties related to ESXi servers, data stores, networks, folders, or inventory properties. There's a lot you can do with searching in the vSphere client, and the more you use it, the more efficient VMware admin you'll be. So with that, let's go back to our slides. Now that we learned about searching, which works across the entire virtual infrastructure, let's talk about sorting and filtering, which just works on a particular list of data that you're looking at in the vSphere client. So let's say that you go to a particular ESXi server in the hosts and virtual machines inventory, and you click on the virtual machines tab to get a list of virtual machines that are running on that particular ESXi host. You could then sort that list by clicking on the column headings in that list of virtual machines. So let's say that you wanted to sort that list of virtual machines by which ones are powered on versus which ones are powered off, or sort the list of virtual machines in ascending alphabetical order or descending alphabetical order, or which ones have VMware Tools installed or not, or which ones have the most amount of storage provisioned. You can very quickly sort that list of data by clicking on any of those column headings. You can also go to the filter box there, and you can type in something. Let's say you typed in powered on. It would filter all the virtual machines and only show you the ones that were powered on. Or maybe you wanted to find all the virtual machines that started with vCenter or started with Windows 2008. You could type that in the filter box. And then you can also use the drop down next to the filter box to specify which things you want to filter on. So now let's go over to the vSphere client, and let me show you exactly how sorting and filtering works. Sorting and filtering in the vSphere client is easy to do, and it works best whenever you have a list of items. For example, if I go up to the highest level here, the vCenter server level, and then go to virtual machines, in my particular lab, I've just got 5 virtual machines here. But I can very quickly sort these, let's say by name, just by clicking on the name column heading here. And notice now this column is grayed, and there's a little arrow up here that's pointing up. That's because these are sorted in alphabetical order. If I want to sort them in reverse alphabetical order, I just click that column heading again, and now they're sorted in reverse alphabetical order. And the same thing works when it comes to the state of the virtual machine, powered on versus powered off, the status of the virtual machine, the host that they're running on. For example, the virtual machines running on ESXi server number 1 are first here, and then the virtual machines running on ESX host number 3 are second. If I move on down here, I can sort the virtual machines by the amount of provisioned space they take, the amount of CPU megahertz they're using, the amount of memory they're using on a particular host, the percentage of guest memory that's being utilized. And I can even right-click here, and I can add other types of column headings. For example, let's say the guest operating system. So now here's the guest operating system, and I can actually click on that. I can hold down if I click and drag it over, and I can drag it more towards the front of this list. For example, if I want this over next to the name of the virtual machine, I can put the guest operating system name right there next to the name of the virtual machine. And there we go. Now I can sort by this list. And that's a great way to group the virtual machines together by guest operating system. But let's say that I wanted to just get a list of all the virtual machines that had Windows Server 2008. I could go up here and use the filter option. That's this blank up here. And I can just type in Windows Server. I'll press enter, and there's all the virtual machines that have Windows Server. I can also use the drop down here to specify what it is I want to filter on. So for example, let's say I wanted to filter on memory size. I'm going to select memory size here, and then I'm going to uncheck these other things. And now I'm just sorting on memory size, and let's say I want to find all the virtual machines that have memory size of 4096. So that's the only virtual machine there that has a memory size of 4096. But if you scroll across here, you'll see memory size isn't actually one of the columns that we're currently displaying. So I'll just right click here, I'll add memory size. By default, it adds it all the way to the right hand side, or just about all the way to the right hand side. And there you can see 4096. I could also just type in 4 here. And if we scroll to the right, look at memory size, there's actually quite a few virtual machines that have a memory size that contains the number 4. So that's not a really practical search because there's lots of virtual machines that have the number 4. On the other hand, a more practical search would be, let's say that I wanted to find virtual machines that have a power state of powered on. A quick search would be to select state here. We'll unselect memory size, and I'll just type the word on. Now we get all the virtual machines that are powered on because they have ON in the state column. So this is how sorting and filtering works in the vSphere client. And at any point I can clear the search here, and now I'm back to my list of all virtual machines running in the virtual infrastructure managed by this vCenter server. Sorting and filtering is easy to master, and it's going to make you a much more efficient VMware admin. The vSphere client has some very nice data export features. You can actually export data from the vSphere client into HTML format, HTML with CSS, Microsoft Excel or XLS format, CSV format, or even XML. So let's say you wanted to export a list of all the virtual machines running in the virtual infrastructure along with all of their particular configurations, like how much RAM they have configured, how much storage they're using, what operating system they have, and what ESXi server they're running on. You could very quickly do this from the File menu by going down to Export and then Export List. You can also export other things like OVF files, which is the open virtualization format, actually a container for a virtual machine to make a virtual machine portable. You could really export a virtual machine that way and then maybe import it into a cloud provider that supports that format. You can export events, you can export graphical maps of the virtual infrastructure, let's say in JPEG format, or even system logs from ESXi hosts. So now let's go over to the vSphere client and I'll walk you through the process of exporting data. Here in the vSphere client, exporting data is very easy to do. You just go up to the File drop-down up here, and then you have Export. You can export events. You can export a list of whatever you're viewing on the screen. You can export maps, system logs, and OVF templates. OVF templates are actually virtual machines, and I'm not going to cover that right now because you're actually exporting an entire virtual machine. Let's just really talk about exporting lists, because exporting lists is very useful for getting data out of the virtual infrastructure and into a report that, let's say, you might give to your boss or to a customer. So let's say I want to export a list of the virtual machines I'm viewing right now on this screen. So this is all the virtual machines in the virtual infrastructure, at least in my lab with the Wired Brain Coffee Company. So I'll click File up here, I'll go to Export, and then to Export List. And now I'm being asked what I want to name this list that I'm exporting from the virtual infrastructure. So I'm going to call it WBC for Wired Brain Coffee, and I'll just call it All VMs. And here we can choose to export it as an HTML, as an Excel workbook, a CSV, or an XML file. Let's go ahead and do an XLS workbook or a Microsoft Excel file. I'll say Save there, and that's it. We just exported data from the virtual infrastructure. So now let me go over to Excel and let's open up that file. Here in Microsoft Excel, I'm going to use Control-O to open a file and then open up this spreadsheet that we just exported. It does say that it's in a slightly different format than what my Excel 2010 recognizes. I'm just going to say yes here because I know we just exported it. And there we go. We get a complete list of all the virtual machines in this virtual infrastructure, along with guest OS, state information, status, host information, provision space, guest virtual machine, memory size, and alarm actions. And you may notice that these column headings are identical to what you were viewing over in the vSphere client. In other words, if you go back to the vSphere client, if we were to actually remove, let's say, the guest OS heading here, and then we were to add, let's say, a DNS name. DNS name is now at the right hand side over here in this column, and then we were to re-export this list again, you would get different column headings. You would have the guest OS removed and the DNS heading added. So in other words, what you see in this list right here in the vSphere client is actually the exact same thing you get when you export the list to an Excel spreadsheet or an HTML file. And the same type of exporting works. Let's say if you were to go to the host tab here and export a list of the hosts in the virtual infrastructure, you can of course also export events, system logs, and maps. So that's exporting in the vSphere client, and with that, let's go back to our slides. Besides exporting data, you can actually export host summary reports in HTML format and performance reports in Microsoft Excel format. To do that, you'd go up to File, down to Report, and then over to either Host Summary or Performance. This is what one of the host summary reports looks like here. Actually, I exported an HTML host summary report, and you can see here I'm running vSphere 5, and I'm running it on a Dell PowerEdge T610. It shows me the number of CPUs, amount of RAM, and then even some performance statistics below that. This report is very detailed. This is just a small picture of what it might look like. I think this is a great way to document your infrastructure or to provide information, let's say, to a consultant or even for disaster recovery purposes. Another report you can export is a Microsoft Excel-based performance report. So this is what a performance report would look like after you run the performance report export. So it just saves it really as an XLS format, and then you can open it up with Microsoft Excel, and then you get all the performance data, let's say, for a particular ESXi server. So now let's go over to the vSphere client, and let's create some performance and host summary reports. Just like exporting lists in the vSphere client, running reports is also very easy. You can go up here to File and down to Report, and then you can run either a host summary or a performance report. However, notice that these are both grayed out. That's because you can't run these unless you've selected a particular host in the virtual infrastructure. So I'm going to go to host ESX3, and then now up to File and down to Report, and notice these are not grayed out anymore. They're black, and you can select them. So I'll select a host summary report. I'll go ahead and put it in this folder here. I'll take the default name here, which is the host name -summary, and then notice you could also save this in an XLS Excel workbook format. I'll just click Save here, and now let's go over to that folder and let's open up that report in our web browser. Here I am in that folder, and if we double click the report we just exported, it brings up the host summary report. So we get information about the host, the hardware on the host, resource utilization, data store information, and virtual machine network info. The performance report looks very similar, and again, you can export it in Excel so that you can manipulate that data, let's say to merge it with other data or even to create charts and graphs. So that's how you export host summary and performance information out of the vSphere client. And with that, let's go back to our slides. And that brings us to the summary for this lesson. I started off with vSphere terminology, things like vCenter, vSphere client, ESXi, host versus guest, virtual machine, virtual network, data stores, virtual data centers, clusters, and resource pools. From there we moved on to using the vSphere client. I showed you how to perform virtual machine, guest, remote control. I showed you how to navigate the vSphere client using hotkeys or shortcuts. After that, I talked about searching the virtual infrastructure. I showed you how to sort and filter data in the vSphere client, how to export data, and run reports. Thanks for watching this lesson covering navigating vSphere using the vSphere client.